Welcome back in here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andy Mack, and we turn our attention to some major international news being made today as a pause on the 15-month conflict between Israel and Hamas, a ceasefire and hostage deal being reached. Let's take you out to Rebecca Castor with this report.
That some details are still being finalized, but ultimately negotiators have reached an agreement.
At long last, I can announce a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached.
It's a major breakthrough that came after intense negotiations between Egypt, Qatar, the U.S., Israel, and Hamas. The draft agreement calls for a 6-week initial ceasefire phase, during which 600 truckloads of humanitarian aid will be delivered to Gaza every day. Hamas will then start releasing hostages, beginning with women, children, and men over 50, in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Negotiations over the second phase will start 16 days later, with the third phase expected to mark the start of Gaza's reconstruction, which will be supervised by Egypt, Qatar, and the UN.
Too many innocent people have died. Too many communities have been destroyed. In this deal, the people of Gaza can finally recover and rebuild.
President Biden says today's agreement is nearly identical to the one he proposed back in May. But it was almost derailed by a last-minute disagreement over Israeli troops deploying along Gaza's border with Egypt. Israel says Hamas backed down, and the Israeli government is expected to vote on the deal on Thursday.
Today begins a responsibility for both sides, who will be supported by the international community and the mediators in order to achieve complete success.
President-elect Trump is also taking a victory lap, writing on social media that the deal was only made possible by his victory in November. In Washington, Rebecca Castor, Fox News.
All right, thank you so much for that, Rebecca. A live look there just about 2:30 in the morning in Israel. And let's take you out to a conversation I had with FDD's Jonathan Schanzer about this deal and what it means for the region. In here to Live Now from Fox, I'm Andy Mack, and let's continue with this breaking news of a ceasefire deal reached between Israel and Hamas, a major pause now in this war between those two entities, some 468 days after that terrorist attack back on October the 7th. I want to put up this post here from Trey Yinks there saying a ceasefire deal, hostage deal was reached. A source briefed on Fox News tells them. And also we're learning more from the IDF as they're calling it Wings of Freedom, the name given to the IDF's preparations for the return of hostages. All right, let's continue on here on Live Now from Fox to learn more about what's going on as Biden says American hostages in captivity will be released in phase 1 of this agreement by Senior VP of Research for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Jonathan Schanzer. Jonathan, you are now in Israel right now. What's the feeling on the ground, and what is your biggest takeaway from the ceasefire deal?
I think it's largely relief here. I think, the hostages have been front and center in Israel since October 7th. The families of the hostages, the people who've been returned, whether by operations or from a previous release brokered by the Egyptians and the Qataris, both of them have really played a double deal here, supporting Hamas and then working to help release the hostages. But what we have right now is this sense in Israel that, we're finally going to see some relief. 33 people released over the course of 42 days. It's mostly going to be women, children, elderly, sick, injured. That's what we're hearing right now. The men of fighting age are going to likely remain in custody. There are those in Israel who are opposed to this deal, that they're saying that giving Hamas 42 days is way too much time to let them get back up on their feet and to prepare for another round of fighting with Israel. So there is some frustration there, but also some frustration with the release of an estimated, we don't know exactly the numbers right now, but what's reported to be an estimated 1,600 Hamas fighters and other terrorists with blood on their hands, that they'll be released to the Gaza Strip, West Bank, Qatar or Turkey, the two Hamas patrons overseas. So it's a mixed bag here, but I do think that by and large, it's something that the people of Israel support.
Yeah, and Biden has said in his address after this came to be that it was a framework that he really laid out, and we heard that Americans would be a part of this first stage of this ceasefire agreement. Can you lay out how the stages work and what came to be and what went into some of these negotiations with the stages?
Yeah, first, let me just say, I know that this is happening under the Biden administration, but I have to say this would not happen unless Trump, were it not for Trump coming out and saying that there would be hell to pay if the hostages were not released. This was something that Hamas took to heart, that Iran took to heart, that Qatar and Egypt and Turkey, all of the double dealing players out there and the malign actors that have been backing Hamas, they understood that the knife was at their throat. With Trump coming into office on January 20th, this deal is going to come to pass literally 24 hours, maybe even less than that, before Trump comes in. They're doing this because they fear him. They fear the sort of unpredictability of Donald Trump. By the way, I've also heard that Steve Witkoff, the incoming envoy for Middle East peace negotiations, that he was part of this deal. The guy doesn't even have a job yet. And yet he's out there in the region. So it's really interesting. But I think Biden's taking a victory lap where perhaps it's not warranted. As for the way this works, it's going to be 42 days. The first exchange comes on Sunday. There'll be a handful of hostages released. And the Israelis will begin the process of releasing Hamas prisoners, and they will also be withdrawing from certain parts that they currently hold in the Gaza Strip. They're not going to leave everything. They're not going to leave any of the border areas. And I think that's the important thing. And I think at the end of the 42 days, at least my interpretation here is that the Israelis are more than willing to go back and keep fighting, even if they don't get all of the hostages out.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. And I know we talked about this happening under the Biden administration, but the Trump administration also playing a very vital role. And Biden saying during that address after the ceasefire, talking about how they're working as one team to make this come to pass. I want to ask you about the next 42 days, because you mentioned that. And we've seen other potential ceasefire deals in the past that didn't live up to what they were. How concerned are you about that we won't even get 6 weeks in?
Look, I think the fear of Trump, I think the fear of the backlash from Trump, I think it's a motivation. But I think there are a couple of other things that happened. Look, this deal was the exact same deal, as I heard it today, was put on the table back in May, and Hamas rejected it. Now, what's happened since May that has prompted Hamas to want to abide by this deal or to accept it? Number one, the Israelis killed Yahya Sinwar, their leader, the man who launched the October 7th attack, the man who was responsible for this entire war breaking out and the maintaining of that war for the subsequent months. He's gone. That's number one. Number two, there was a lot of help that Hamas was getting from Hezbollah, terrorist group, also sponsored by Iran, based in Lebanon. They'd been firing rockets, thousands of them, at Israel from the country's north, while Hamas was fighting in the south. At a certain point, as we know, starting in the summer, the Israelis really just went on a counteroffensive. They'd finally kind of reached a breaking point, and they destroyed the vast majority of Hezbollah's arsenal. They killed Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, right? We know the beeper operation, all these things. So those two factors, plus Trump getting elected, I think has swung the perception of Hamas that they can somehow keep fighting and they could somehow win. That, I think, has been the game changer. And so it's for that reason that I think Hamas is going to want to abide by this. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to go perfectly. I expect there to be hiccups. I expect there to be challenges. But I do think that there's a team in place right now that is motivated by some of the unbelievable changes that have taken place in the Middle East and in Washington over the last 3 to 6 months.
And we definitely seen a different tone in terms of this one versus other previous negotiations or ceasefires that we've tried to follow very closely, but a very different sense of what's going on there right now. And we also talked about these negotiations, talking about how after the war, and although they might return fighting in 6 weeks' time, how much of a two-state solution, how much is there a conversation about the future of this region inside of these negotiations?
Oh, I don't think there's much talk of that at all. I mean, I do think that, we know that the outgoing Biden administration, they're talking right now about trying to, revitalize the Palestinian Authority government that's in the West Bank and to create structures that might be able to serve the Palestinian people moving forward. I think all of that is premature. And I think, by the way, it's almost impossible when you have two competing Palestinian forces, right? The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is run by the PLO. And then you've got Hamas, which is still trying to cling to power in the Gaza Strip. There will be no Palestinian Authority if you have two competing factions literally fighting for power. They've been in a state of civil war to varying degrees, really since 2007. So I think that, as far as I'm concerned, when you look at regional peace prospects with the Saudis or with some of the other Arab states, two-state solution questions, all of those things, very premature to talk about until Israel is finally able to remove the threat of Hamas, actually show the region what it looks like to win a war. And then I think victory will probably lead to other opportunities. And I do get a sense that's what the entire region is thinking right now.
Yeah, and like you said, this may just be a pause on that fighting for those 6 weeks time period. Jonathan Schanzer, anything else that you'd like to add? Anything else that you're kind of keeping an eye on over this 6 weeks period?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would just note here is, how they release, who they release. I think we're going to see probably a handful of bodies come home, and that's going to be brutal. And it's going to, I think, obviously color the way the Israelis look at a phase 2 of this deal. They're little children that have been held in captivity. If they come back alive, it's one thing. If they come back dead, it's another. I think the women that have been held in captivity, we're expecting to hear horrific stories about sexual violence. And of course, they've been in custody now for 15 months. You can only imagine what they've gone through. So I think it's going to be some heartbreaking stuff, even amidst some of the happiness. There's going to be heartwarming stories about families being reunited, but there is going to be a pall of sadness and anger that's going to linger over all of this. So I think we just need to wait and see what some of these emotions, how that's going to lead to future policies. Policy and emotion, they don't mix well. So we'll wait and see how this plays out in Israel, and of course how it's going to play out in the Palestinian arena as well.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. The hostages, they're in captivity for 400 plus days, like you mentioned this, but a ceasefire deal coming to fruition today, as they're calling it, the Wings of Freedom, the IDF saying that, and what their operation there to get the hostages back. All right, Jonathan, thank you so much. I appreciate your time as always. Stay safe there in Israel.